Whakalofalahi atu, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Colin, for that lovely introduction. So I am going to open up this session by talking a little bit about the international history of how research ethics has come to be governed within a whole lot of different jurisdictions internationally, because there's an interesting pattern that countries have experienced. And I'd love to hear about the Niuean experience and where things sit at the moment. But the pattern that I really want to talk about is to do with the kind of reactivity, I suppose, of how research ethics has been formulated and regulated. And that's really nicely expressed in this quote from an American bioethics scholar, Carol Levine. So she says that research ethics has been born in scandal and reared in protectionism. And what she really means there is that there's been this ongoing pattern where researchers have gone off and they've done something they think is good, and they've been able to do that without any real institutional sort of safeguards. And society has discovered what they've been doing and have found it unconscionable. So there's been this kind of pattern of a research event, a scandal, and then a kind of a regulatory response to that. So what I thought I would do in the time I have is just tell you a little bit about two of those events. And there's so many of them. I could have chosen a multiplicity of different things that have happened in different places, including in Aotearoa. But I've chosen one of the very early ones and one of the very famous ones. And what I'm going to do is take from that some of the themes, the things that we can learn about the risks really of that face research. And I'll talk a little bit about two of the key institutional responses to these things. And I think that will lead on very well to Reverend Matangi's talk next, and Gaileen's after that. So the early one that I wanted to tell you about involves this man here. So this is Albert Nasser, who is actually a very well-known medical scientist as well as a doctor. He was a doctor who worked in venereology and in dermatology in Prussia, back when Prussia was a thing. And he was very interested in work that was happening mostly in Northern Europe, looking at developing new ways of inoculating against diseases, communicable diseases. And he had a particular interest in syphilis. So he had learned a bit about what was happening in Northern Europe and tried to use the same technique, which involved deriving a serum from syphilis and then extracting the cells, what he thought was extracting the cells from that serum, and using the serum to inoculate people against syphilis. So he thought, well, obviously I'm going to need to test to see whether this works. Who should I test it on? He was a doctor at a big hospital, and he had access to patients, and he decided that he would test this on girls and women who were coming into his clinic, who he deemed to be at risk of being exposed to syphilis. So he did the first 4 with quite a low dose, and he didn't tell them that they were part of research or that he was giving them this thing against syphilis. They thought that he was treating them for what they had presented with. He had them come back and they hadn't developed syphilis. So he took heart in this and decided to up the dose and gave it to a few more people, and those women did develop syphilis. And this became public knowledge. I don't know quite how it leaked out, But the public was outraged by this. They were outraged by the fact that he had taken it upon himself to expose these women to potential risk of developing syphilis, and that he had not sought their consent. So the sentiment was so strong that the Prussian government felt that they had to regulate. So they introduced what appears to me from my research to be the earliest regulation requiring consent for inclusion in research. But that got swept away in the kind of arc of history and, the dissolution of the Prussian Empire. And it wasn't until after World War II and the doctor's trial and the Nuremberg Code being written, and in fact, even some years after that, really, that there came to be a much more widespread recognition that research was an area that needed more than just researchers going off and doing their own thing. So the famous episode that I wanted to talk a little bit about is the Tuskegee syphilis studies. So this happened, and this has had such a profound impact, really, on the development of regulation and formalized research ethics internationally. So unlike NACE's work, the Tuskegee syphilis studies didn't involve administering anything. Instead, it involved really failing to do that, failing to administer. So the Tuskegee syphilis studies were undertaken by the US Public Health Service, and they started back in 1932. So in the 1930s, there wasn't a known treatment for syphilis, and the Public Health Service really wanted to understand the natural history of a disease like syphilis. So how long people can live with it, what kind of effects it has, what characterizes people who live for many years with syphilis versus people who die quite early. So they decided to do some work investigating this, and they used black sharecroppers from Alabama. So these were men who, for around 399 of them had syphilis, and the others were controls. So they were identified as eligible for this study. They were not told that they had syphilis for the 399 that did. This term, there was a local term that you have bad blood. So they were told that they had bad blood, but not that this was syphilis. And that meant, of course, they couldn't be told about the implications for their families. So they were studied longitudinally, brought into the hospital. They had tests done on them. They were given a meal. They got some payment when they died towards their funeral. There were certain benefits. So they believed that they were being benefited. By the 1960s, when it became clear that penicillin was an effective treatment for syphilis, these men were not offered penicillin. So they were just retained in the study to see what happened if they were never offered treatment. And it was only in the 1970s, again, when journalists became aware of it, and there was a big scandal that the study stopped. And it led to a US presidential inquiry that led to the Belmont report and eventually a presidential apology. So there are a number of themes that we can take from these two examples, but also the many others like this that I think give us pause when we're thinking about research. So these involve researchers who are working in a field where there are no established rules. They have positions of power, so they have some freedoms that go with that power. They have influence, and they don't have formal lines of accountability that would prevent them from acting on their own research agendas. So they have quite a lot of power and capacity to do what they see as valuable. And that's another risk, that researchers are usually driven by a sense of the value of what they're doing. And their sense of value can sometimes be quite divorced from what wider society sees as valuable. So they're isolated from the views of wider society, and they have access to people who they can use as a research population. And those people tend to have less institutional power, and partly their powerlessness is maintained because they are not told. They are not told the full story. They don't really know what it is that they're participating in, and that means that they're not very able to protect themselves. So these are common risks with research scandals, and they have led to the situation that we have in Aotearoa and in many other countries where there's regulation, but even more than that, there's some institutional policies and requirements around research. So the first way that institutions like universities, governments, ministries of health, etc., have tried to manage the risks of research have really been to do with defining what are the principles, what are the ethical principles that we should apply to research, what should we expect researchers to live up to when we're thinking about what they do. And in New Zealand, we've sort of settled with two frameworks that are applied together. So one of them expresses tikanga from Mātauranga Māori, so that's Te Ara Tika, and the other is the four principles approach, which has come from America and has been around since about the 1970s. And it expresses what are supposed to be universal ethical principles. I'm really interested in having a discussion about that later if you want. So I'm not going to go over these in too much detail because I don't want to take more time than I ought to. But so the first thing is really setting up what are the principles that we need researchers to observe. And then we need some way of telling whether those are being followed. And this is really where the second institutional approach has come in. And that has largely been ensuring that research is reviewed and approved by a body, which in New Zealand we would call an ethics committee. In America, they would call it an institutional review board. And so here, the ethics committees have a number of different purposes. So the first is really doing that review. So they review what the researchers are planning and they provide feedback and suggestions. And their intent is to ensure that the research is acceptable to a community, and they require members who are representatives of the community as well as experts who can really assess what is the case for doing the research and doing it like this. So they do the review, they make suggestions, and then they do this thing which I think researchers don't appreciate enough, which is that they then approve research. So they lend their own moral weight really to this thing. They say, we think that this is okay. We give this our seal of approval. And that is so important when it comes to maintaining the trust of a community. The fact that something has been through ethics review and been approved really matters to how a community sees things. So that the fact that approval does make a difference to people's decisions means that the approval has to be done in a serious way. It has to be taken seriously. And that requires some formality around the processes, the ethical guidelines, how decisions are made known to the community, and how researchers are kind of held accountable for complying with the terms of the approval. So as any of you will know who've gone through research ethics, it can be a very formulaic quite detailed process. It's not always fun, I have to say. I don't enjoy doing it, but we can break down the processes, what ethics committees are looking at, into three main categories. So the first is that research ethics committees really have to assess what is the value of this research. Is it valuable to our community? Would it express our community values? Is it designed in a way that means it's going to deliver that value? Is this set of researchers the right people to do it? How can we know that the results of this research will be disseminated, or is this just being done for the researchers so that they can tick boxes? How are we going to ensure that the value is actually going to be delivered? So that's the first series of questions that ethics committees have to ask themselves. And then that has to be really measured against the risks. So here's this thing that might have value, but what risks are associated with it? And who are those risks going to be experienced by? Is it participants? Are they going to be told about those risks? Is it the community in general? Maybe this is something that doesn't involve participants, but there's a risk that the community will be represented in a way that is not in the community's interests, that is offensive to a community. How are those risks going to be managed? And what about risks to researchers? Because researchers can sometimes be prone to risks as well, physical risks, sometimes emotional risks. And what about institutions? How might this affect the trust in an institution, or an institution's ability to maintain its own ethical standpoint? And what are the plans about mitigating that? And how do these things balance? So you're doing a kind of cost-benefit exercise around the values and the risks. And then, of course, and we see, from cases like NACE's work and the Tuskegee studies, that idea of giving people a choice about what they contribute to, we can see why that's become so central in ethics review, that participants, by and large, there are some exceptions, but they ought to be able to decide whether they participate in research, and they should be able to do that without worrying about how their decision will affect their standing, how it will affect access to services, for instance. We need to think about, what about if kids are involved? Who should be making decisions? Whose consent is required? How's recruitment going to happen, etc. So the job of research ethics committees is nuanced and challenging, and it results in, when done well, it can result in much more willingness to have research done in a community. So I guess I'll leave it there, and I'm very interested to hear Reverend Matangi and Gayleen. Kia ora.
Thank you very much.
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you.